Hello, everyone. My name's Louisa Mamooney. I'm one of the members of the board of the Community of Policy Professionals. Welcome to the Community of Policy Professionals webinar with our double feature on commissioning and how this is transforming early intervention services. And secondly, in the double act, stakeholder engagement in the policy context. I'd like to open by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting today and showing my respect to elders past, present and emerging, as well as extending a warm welcome to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders that we may have joining us today. I'd like to welcome our presenters, starting with Kitsa and Anthony. I'll introduce our second speakers, Paul McKnight and Stephen Bray, at 4 p.m. Kitsa Papadopoulos is the Director of Commissioning Excellence at the Department of Communities and Justice. Kitsa has spent time in DPC, ministerial offices and New South Wales Treasury before joining DCJ. Kitsa's recent roles at Commissioning New South Wales in DCJ have focused on driving commissioning and to service delivery and lifting commissioning capability across the sector. Anthony Shannon is currently the Director of Early Intervention, Volunteering and Youth at the Department of Communities and Justice. Kitsa and Anthony have a presentation ready to share with you today before we open it up to questions from the audience. If you have a question, pop it in the chat with all in WebEx and I'll facilitate the questions at the end of the presentation. And before I hand over to Kitsa and Anthony, can I please just check that you have your camera off and your microphone off as well. And you can do this by clicking the first two buttons that come up on your screen, and they should be red if they are off. Okay, I'll be passing over to Kitsa and Anthony now if they'd like to bring their presentation up.
Hi everyone, I hope you can all see me okay. I'm Kitsa Papadopoulos. I'm the Director of Commissioning Excellence in the Department of Communities and Justice. And thanks for everyone for coming today. What we'll be doing this afternoon is you'll be finding out a bit more about commissioning and what that means. My partner for this presentation is Anthony Shannon. Anthony, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Kitsa. My name's Anthony Shannon. I'm the Director for Early Intervention, Volunteering and Youth with the Department of Communities and Justice. Thanks for the opportunity this afternoon to reflect on how early intervention is transforming, commissioning is transforming early intervention services in New South Wales.
Thanks, Anthony. So commissioning is the big buzzword for this presentation. And as you might be able to tell from the t-shirt, I'm very passionate about commissioning. I will assume that some people might have heard of the concept, perhaps in relation to initiatives in your own department or other major initiatives in government like Their Futures Matter or the National Disability Insurance Scheme or even franchising of bus services recently in New South Wales. But many of you might not have heard of it at all. So today we'll be sharing with you what commissioning means for the Department of Communities and Justice and how this approach has absolutely transformed the way we design, deliver and manage services for our clients. By the end of this presentation, I hope you'll all be lining up to get your own commissioning t-shirt. So like many of you, I feel like I've lived through so many fads and fashions through my career in the New South Wales government. Things like evidence-based policy making, data, customer, contestability, efficiency, evaluation, and more recently the new buzzwords are things like outcomes, human-centred design, place-based, and market stewardship. And believe me, I was on board with all of these things. How can you not be? But it wasn't until commissioning came along that there was all of a sudden a way that I could think about my work and about the whole business of government actually that brought all of these concepts and more together. Commissioning is an approach to service delivery that puts clients at the centre and outcomes at the centre and leverages the best strengths of government, non-government and private providers to deliver outcomes for clients. There's a whole of government policy, which is called the New South Wales Commissioning and Contestability Policy. It was released in 2016 and it mandates that all of us in the New South Wales government should be taking a commissioning approach to service delivery. As I flagged earlier, what that actually means picks up many of those fashionable trends all together in one concept. In our department, our commissioning principles are client-centric, outcomes-based, value for money, integrated, and evidence-informed. We guide our people to apply a commissioning approach through a commissioning cycle. The cycle is not necessarily sequential, but it sets out some general steps that you need to go through when you are developing or reviewing a service. It starts with having a deep understanding of client need and tapping into clients' own views about their needs and tapping into client voices where possible. Then understanding what you've got to work with to try to make a difference, what interventions are possible, which interventions are evidence-based, and which providers are available in the market. You then develop a strategy around how to deliver the intervention, how to procure the providers, and of course, you have to monitor and evaluate always. The Department of Family and Community Services made a strategic commitment to shift to a commissioning way of working in 2016. We are now a merged department with Justice, so we're the Department of Communities and Justice, and since the merger, we are continuing on our journey of developing our commissioning maturity. Anthony and I are now going to tell you a story about one program, which was one of the first cabs off the rank to try a commissioning approach in our department. It will illustrate for you how the commissioning mindset required us to do things very differently than what we might have done otherwise. So Anthony, tell us about where you were with early intervention service delivery in around 2016.
So our early intervention service system is essentially about ensuring that families, children, young people's needs are met earlier to prevent the escalation of that need, and that risk factors that lead to child abuse and neglect, domestic and family violence are addressed earlier. So we're talking about a $160 million investment across 750 contracts with 500 organisations. The types of services we're talking about in the program are things like family support services, supported playgroups, neighbourhood centres, youth services, case management services, to name a few. The early intervention landscape that we have in place now, back in 2016, was very different to what we have now. Back then in 2016, we had 5 separate programs running across the early intervention spectrum. They were historic. Different program guidelines, different criteria for clients were in place for all those 5 programs. It was a complex system to navigate. It wasn't flexible for families and young people seeking support, and it certainly wasn't to some degree meeting the needs of all people accessing the services. Some of the services that we were investing in were no longer located excuse me, in communities where the needs were highest, and some of our services were not working with vulnerable cohorts. And some of our service models we know were certainly not grounded in evidence. Communities had changed, but our programs are not really adapted to meet the changing needs of those communities. We had no centralised data collection, rather we had 4 separate data collections across those programs and no real clear line of sight into outcomes. But it wasn't all bad. We had a really good mix of organisations in the system delivering services, and they looked to be delivering effective early intervention services, and some of our social infrastructure in early intervention was really valued and was well utilised by communities as well. And importantly, our sector partners and peaks had indicated a willingness to work with us to improve the system. So in 2016, after some extensive consultation with a wide range of stakeholders, we released a public report outlining some key strategic reform directions, and they became known as the Targeted Early Intervention Reform.
So Anthony, that sounds like a program with a lot of historical baggage that sounds like it was ripe for change in so many aspects. I can see how there would have been so many ideas to do something completely different and get much better value for money and better outcomes out of the total spend. But I understand there were some constraints that meant you couldn't just throw it all up in the air.
Yes, that's right. We had some clear reform directions. We really wanted to make sure that our early intervention services were informed by evidence and targeted to need. We wanted to have an outcomes-focused approach to the program, and we wanted the program to be much more flexible and much more client-centred and be able to be responsive to the strengths, needs and assets in local communities. But we did have some constraints, as you mentioned. We had no new funding. We had to work within our existing program funding. We had some limitations put on us as well about moving funds across the state and moving funds across providers. And we were also required to redesign the service system with our existing service providers in the first instance.
So Anthony, that's a situation that many of us might be put in as policymakers in government, where the government is at once saying we want a big change, we want to see clients really getting what they need, but also don't make waves and don't disrupt the system. So it sounded like you both needed to achieve change, but without disruption. So how did you do that?
This is where adopting a commissioning approach really allowed us to think about how we reshape the system, working with our sector partners to deliver on those reform objectives that I mentioned earlier. That both government, the sector, and reform outcomes that both the government, the sector and community saw as valuable. So the key starting point was really about engagement. And by that, I mean listening to the range of voices across the service system and across a range of stakeholders, working in partnership and taking a collaborative design approach to initiating change. So what we initially did was we established some local district-based planning and design mechanisms, which included a range of early intervention stakeholders. And these groups looked at a whole range of local data and evidence to identify priorities in communities, to identify outcomes in communities, and basically to redesign the early intervention service system at the local level. We also established a central governance group, which comprised 6 of our early intervention peaks, which represented the early intervention service system. And we spent a lot of time talking to the sector. We made a deliberate decision and effort to engage early with the sector around why we were looking to make the changes that we planned to make. And we looked for opportunities wherever we could to obtain buy-in from the sector in terms of that change. We spent a lot of time making the case for change, both directly with providers, with peaks and a range of other stakeholders across the system. We really wanted to bring, and the objective of this really was we really wanted to bring the sector along with us in the reform process and helping them focus on why we wanted to make the changes that we wanted to make. The benefits for families and communities we saw as really important. And importantly, we also committed to working with the sector to build trust and improve sector capability. So we invested in what we called our sector assistance strategy, which funded a range of sector-wide activities, such as helping organisations to develop program logics, understand outcomes, and assist individual providers to support change.
So Anthony, I think a lot of people in the audience today would be hearing a lot about outcomes, but you've actually been living and breathing an outcomes-based approach for the past few years with TEI, and you knew that one of the things you needed to change about early intervention services was to be more connected to client needs and to be clearer about what outcomes were expected from these interventions. So how did you go about introducing an understanding of outcomes that matter to clients and a discipline around measuring outcomes?
Good point. It's a good point, Kit. Understanding, driving and measuring outcomes was really central to our reform agenda. It was probably one of the key things that we did together with the sector, which really made a significant change in people understanding the reform directions and also progressing the reform. We didn't really have a good handle on this going into the reform about how we were going to work with the sector to get the sector across the line in understanding and thinking more about outcomes. But we certainly knew that the sector was up for a conversation around outcomes. And we knew we needed to have some rigor around whatever we did. So we took an evidence-informed practice approach to how we discussed outcomes with the sector. And by that I mean we looked to evidence-based programs, but also we looked to practitioner evidence and, importantly, client experiences and value as well to help us kind of flesh out the broader conversation with the sector around outcomes. So we redesigned our targeted early intervention program using evidence. We used the Australian Research Alliance for Children and Youth Better Systems, Better Chances report to develop the new targeted early intervention program. And that report was a synthesis of factors that promoted positive child development and enabled effective prevention and early intervention services at the system level. And you'll see there the new targeted early intervention program that we developed together with the sector. So we started a conversation with the sector about early intervention outcomes. We worked jointly with stakeholders to better understand client needs at a local level. And we talked to the sector about outcomes and about what outcomes were important to them and what outcomes were important to the communities in which they worked. And we also talked to a range of clients, including quite a number of consultations with Aboriginal communities across the state. And this was really valuable in our fleshing out the conversation about outcomes and a real learning opportunity. And it was also something I think we really should have done more of because it was such a rich and rewarding experience. So together with the sector, we developed the Targeted Early Intervention Outcomes Framework, which really detailed what outcomes early intervention service providers would contribute to and what we would measure and how we would evaluate. This outcomes framework was aligned to the New South Wales Human Services Outcomes Framework, a whole of government human services approach to understanding outcomes. So the development of the Targeted Early Intervention Outcomes Framework took us 18 months and many conversations with the sector. It was quite a lot. It was hard work and it took some time, but in hindsight, it was a very productive and rewarding experience. The lengthy development time actually, in some respects, worked in our favour as it gave us quite a bit more time to bring the sector along with us. And we'd been clear up front that we wanted to adopt a try, test and learn approach and that we would work with the sector to iterate the process as we went along. And grounding this work in the Human Services Outcomes Framework and some of the pathways to outcomes work done there also brought rigour and credibility to this process. So getting service providers over the hill and understanding what they were doing was a contribution to an outcome and that they were not the sole contributor to that outcome was really critical. This helped providers recognise their contribution in the context of the wider service system. We also adopted the Australian Government Department of Social Services Data Exchange platform as our new program data collection portal. This significantly lifted our capability to capture program data, report on program outcomes, and make this data available to the sector. The data exchange is able to incorporate a range of validated wellbeing and outcomes tools that service providers were already using some of these tools as well.
So Anthony, one of the risks in going down that road about being evidence-based is what about when the evidence is low or it's not available? How do you deal with that? And also, what about if you discover a service that's been running and there is no evidence base for what they're doing? Do you rule out funding any services where there's no evidence?
It's a good question. We know there's a lot of evidence around the effectiveness of intervening early, but in some parts of our early intervention system, evidence around the types of service models, the types of activities that really make a difference is not strong. And this is due to a range of reasons. So where this was the case, we didn't rule out not funding those services. What we did was we took this as an opportunity to look to see how we could continue to build the evidence where there were gaps. We're working with all our providers to ensure that program logics underpin their service delivery and that those program logics were informed by evidence and also an understanding of theory of change as well that providers were employing. Where, for example, the evidence was thin, we looked to what the data was telling us about outcomes, what practitioners were telling us, and importantly, what clients were experiencing in those services that were being delivered to them. Is anything changing for those families and communities through investing in those services? And what are the common elements, the critical components of services that were really making a difference? And these are the kind of things that we were looking for to help us build the evidence. We committed to continue to work with providers to adjust their service activities as the evidence grows, and so that over time we will continue to build evidence and invest in what works in the program. So using a try, test and learn approach in this context with the sector was really giving us some agility.
So it's clear that TEI services are so specific to communities, especially things like neighbourhood centres, for example. They're really specific to a local community context. So we hear a lot about this concept of place-based solutions lately. How did you approach local and place-based decision-making in TEI?
One of the things we really focused on was local decision making. So as I mentioned earlier, we adopted a local collaborative design process both through our district staff and the sector to really try and drive some of the authorised local decision making. So it wasn't really a top-down approach, but it was one led at the district level. So Department of Communities and Justice has 7 districts across the state. And those district staff really worked together closely in partnership with the sector around some of the planning work that was done and some of the decisions around priorities for the communities in which they were working. So we provided our districts with a range of data broken down where we could to the local government level, and districts then added in some of their local data, some of their local planning information to help with those discussions around redesigning the service system. So how districts approached these discussions also looked differently across some districts, and that was a deliberate decision that we made to ensure that local decisions were taken in terms of service design, and it wasn't a cookie cutter approach laid out across the state centrally. Also, to our investment across the state is very different in some parts of the state in the early intervention system, so it allowed us to take that into context as well. This local governance arrangement that we put in place was really welcomed by the sector, and certainly something that the sector had been talking to us about for quite some time, about having more input locally into decisions made around what early intervention services were delivered in the communities in which they worked. Again, it was quite a lot of hard work. It took quite a lot of time and was really resource intensive, particularly for our district staff, but it was really well worth the effort.
So Anthony, all of this sounds really good for the design and planning phase, but things always get tricky once we hit the procurement phase. And I've heard it said before that we might have had the providers and the government in the tent in the beginning, but as soon as procurement starts, they tend to go back into their own camps. So how did you approach your procurement to keep bringing providers along with you and to avoid the disruption also that the Minister definitely didn't want, that we talked about earlier?
Excuse me. So when we thought about procurement, we really wanted to build on our early engagement efforts with the sector that helped drive change. So we previously signalled to the market that about what our early intervention priorities were, and also what the client cohorts were that we wanted to invest in and see some increased service delivery to. We'd also undertaken quite a lot of design work in collaboration with the sector, with our existing service providers. And we clearly signalled to the market as well that we wanted to see an increased investment in Aboriginal service delivery in the early intervention service system. So when it came time to procurement, we decided to negotiate with our existing 500 organisations who were already delivering services. They'd been with us on the journey from the start. They put in quite a lot of work, and arguably they were better placed to understand and implement some of the changes with which we were looking to make. This also helped to manage any risks and disruptions to service delivery that may come up with making significant change like we were looking to make. And again, this is where the commissioning approach was really helpful. It really gave us this opportunity to be able to work with our existing providers to continue to make the change. So we're really aiming to kind of leverage, I guess, off our early engagement efforts and transition providers to the new service system without any significant disruption to service delivery. We had a range of contract terms that we negotiated with providers. So we had contract terms which ran which would run from 5 years. Some would be 3, some would be 2, and some would be 1. And where providers were able to deliver on change milestones, then we would offer them further years on top of their initial contract term, which would then realise a 5-year contract for that provider. If we didn't reach agreement with providers, or the provider was not delivering on some of the change milestones with which we'd agreed, then we will have in the future the opportunity to recommission those funds in line with some of the local priorities. And that could be through a tender process or select tender or even direct negotiation, depending on the context. And this negotiated contract term process was really a very different way of working to what DCJ had done previously. And again, the commissioning framework allowed us the opportunity to take this new approach with the sector.
Thanks, Anthony. So can you now tell us about any barriers that you came across, and how did you get over those barriers?
Yes, there were a number of concerns raised by various stakeholders, concerns about transparency. So we're asked questions like, how can you redesign the service system and then negotiate new contracts with the same group of providers? Under the commissioning framework, we can, and it's actually a real strength, I think, of commissioning that we are allowed to do that. We made sure that we communicated throughout the design process with providers about what the outcomes were that we were looking to deliver on, so that those providers knew before sitting down to negotiate a contract what were the outcomes with which we were going to ask them to deliver. And where and what sort of services that we were looking to change. So it's actually quite a beneficial way to kind of, I guess, progress some of that change. We had no new funding, so that was a challenge. We had to consider how we could transition existing services, including any impacts on clients, into the new system. And as mentioned earlier, in some areas we had some really limited evidence, and this presented some significant difficulties in terms of our decision making. The approach we took again was thinking about how we adopt a try, test and learn approach, and continue to locally engage with providers and make changes as we go along, depending on what the data is telling us.
So where are you now since starting in 2016, 4 years on? Where are you at, and how's it looking?
So as at the end of June, we've completed our 750 contract negotiations, except for about 30, which we've had to extend due to the pandemic. So we're continuing to work closely with our peaks and other government partners, and we've seen significant change across some parts of the service system in different parts of the state, and we're continuing to support other parts of the service system that are continuing to make changes, and those changes that have been agreed to, it's looking promising. Providers are really on board with the change process. There's about 70% of our contracts have landed a 5-year contract term, which was one of the key things we wanted to do for the sector, was deliver longer term contracts. We've had some providers who have declined to enter into new contracts, and that's allowed us then to redirect those funds to address emerging needs and local priorities across the state.
Thanks, Anthony, for sharing that experience. I hope you guys all thought that was as interesting as I do. I think it's a great example of how commissioning really embodies so many other important concepts, like evidence-based, outcomes-based, place-based. And it helps us actually execute those concepts by giving us other tools like client needs analysis, sector collaboration, different procurement methods, and market stewardship. More importantly, I think commissioning reflects a more mature understanding of the way government can interact with markets. Traditionally in government, I think we might believe government is over here and the market is over there, and we try to use procurement processes to meet in the middle. But commissioning encourages us to think about providers, whether they're non-government or private, or whether they're current providers or potential providers, as our partners. And this creates a lot of opportunities to leverage the strengths that different parties can bring to delivering client outcomes, and it creates massive opportunities to lift performance in that regard. but it's not easy. And my observation is that taking a commissioning approach to any given service is much more intensive and requires new capabilities, but the payoff can be great and the upfront investment can set you up with a strong foundation for the future. We've been investing in commissioning capability in DCJ over recent years, and I have watched the light bulb moments that our staff are having as they learn more about commissioning. There are lots of tools and guidance available for you, and so I encourage you to have a look at the Commissioning New South Wales materials on the New South Wales Treasury website, and there's also a commissioning community of practice that you can join. But what you'll soon realise is that commissioning really is a mindset. In DCJ, we recently held a commissioning leadership program, and on the last day of the training, one of our participants made the very profound reflection that commissioning is not a moment. I think what she means is it's not something you do today and not tomorrow, and it's not also something that you enter in lightly. It's actually a whole mindset, and I loved that so much. I had the T-shirt made, and on the back of the T-shirt it says it's a lifestyle. It's certainly a lifestyle for me, and I hope it can become part of your lifestyle too. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to your questions and discussion.
Hello, and thank you very much for the presentation. Just a quick note, if audience members, if you can make sure your video is off and your mute is on, that would be great. But if you do have any questions, pop them into the chat with all, and I'll facilitate those questions to Kitsa and Anthony. So I thought, just while people are having a think about the questions that they would like to ask you both, I wanted to ask about evidence, because particularly in your work, and there are a few areas like this, like everyone has an opinion about kids and what services they should get, whether they know them personally or whether they don't know them at all. So how did you go about kind of bringing an evidence base to the conversation?
Anthony, do you want to go ahead with this one?
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question. The issue of evidence is something in early intervention which has been kind of discussed a lot across the sector. I guess at a macro level, there's really good evidence around understanding that early intervention works. Investing early, is far better than investing downstream. But in terms of some of the service models and the activities that we invest in, there's not a lot of strong evidence around in terms of an early intervention context, in terms of child protection. So what we committed to do with the sector was to continue to work with the sector to build that evidence. So we're in the process of setting up an evidence portal which the sector will be able to access, which will really take a common elements approach to understanding evidence. So what are the common components of successful early intervention programs, the core components which we'd like to see in the activities that are being delivered by all our providers. And that's also underpinned by some program logic work which we're doing across the whole of the service system. So all of our 750 contracts across the state need to have a program logic which kind of links the activities they're doing on the ground to what the evidence is telling them, to what the theory of change that they're employing. And through the kind of development of those program logics and the ongoing work with the sector to reflect on those program logics and kind of build them as we go, in some cases where we know the evidence is really thin on the ground or not in existence, is something that we've kind of committed to do. And we've really started to see some of that unfold really early on, with the sector engaging in changing their activities in line with what evidence we do know. And also too, through our new data collection system, the data exchange, or it's commonly known as the DEX, which Department of Social Services run, will have really rich data around what's the dosage of services, where services have been delivered to which client cohorts. So we'll have a much better opportunity to further build that evidence.
Thanks. And a follow-on question to that, and I think you touched on it there, but I was wondering if you can explore it a little bit further in detail, because when we think about policy implementation, it often does come down to the detail, and of those kind of contracts that then become really the basis of the government's ability to influence the experience on the ground for people. What sort of evidence of outcomes is expected to be provided or to be given to you by the providers of those contracted services?
Yeah, the kind of journey around with the sector around kind of the move to kind of outcomes and understanding outcomes, kind of driving towards outcomes in early intervention has been a really interesting process. We've got a really diverse sector across early intervention. Some of our providers have a really strong understanding of outcomes, and parts of our service system, it's a bit of a new concept. So we put a lot of time and work into kind of, I guess, working with the sector, first of all, to understand the kind of concept of kind of moving to an outcomes framework, what it means to be able to deliver services that contribute to outcomes, the larger outcomes, without individual, small neighbourhood centres feeling like they're solely responsible for providing an outcome in child protection or homelessness, for example. So as I mentioned, through our data collection system, we have built into the DEX, the data exchange. They do have an outcomes tool, which all providers will use. It's called the SCORE, and it's an evidence-informed outcomes tool that all providers will complete with clients. Ideally, clients should complete it themselves, but in some cases, providers will do it with clients, and that really gives us an indication of changes that clients experience, the kind of satisfaction levels they have, their experience of the service they delivered. And kind of underneath that, there's a range of, again, kind of evidence-informed wellbeing tools that some providers use with clients to help them understand outcomes. And again, that's able to be translated into the data exchange platform as well. And once we start to kind of collect that information, we'll be able to start, together with the data, we'll be able to start kind of having much more line of sight into what outcomes that providers are contributing to.
And just to build on that, I would just add that you'll never go from no outcomes in contracts to all of a sudden having outcomes in contracts. It's likely to take a number of cycles to get there. Certainly in our experience in out-of-home care, we recommissioned out-of-home care in 2017. And that process was really all about just putting some outcomes on the table that we could all get behind, like reducing the number of kids entering into care, reducing the time spent in care, and making it a better experience for kids while they are in care, and finding more permanent solutions for kids. So that was all kind of in the service design at a high level. It's certainly the contract documentation at a high level, but when it comes to actually now trying to design how we'll measure that and how we'll reflect that in contracts, we did what we could in that first round of contracts. Meanwhile, through the 5 years of the contracts, we're running a trial called the QAF, the Quality Assurance Framework, where we start to test how you can actually measure outcomes. And then by the time we're ready for the next round of contracts, we'll be moving on kind of to the next step. And that's important to take that stepped approach as well, to bring, because we can't get there overnight, let alone the sector get there as well.
Yeah. Did you put in specific measures for vulnerable groups, culturally and linguistically diverse, Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, refugee families? Can you tell us a bit more about how you kind of accounted for the specialist needs of those groups?
Yeah, we had some priority kind of client cohorts, which we wanted to see more service delivery and increased investment to. So children 0 to 5, Aboriginal communities, young parents, and adolescents as well, experiencing kind of mental health issues, were kind of 4 key client cohorts with which we decided to increase more service delivery to. And that really came out of looking again at the range of data and the needs analysis work that was done. And together with our stronger communities investment unit work that they'd done around the data work that they'd done around identifying client cohorts and vulnerable groups, that kind of went into the mix to kind of prioritise those top 4. And we're, again, through the data collection, we're able to identify, we will be able to identify what services are being delivered to those client cohorts. But also locally, at the local level, where some of those conversations were had around kind of service system redesign, there's some local priority groups with which communities came up with, and in some parts of the state, as you mentioned, there's some cultural and linguistic diverse communities, and other kind of priority groups which with local DCJ staff have included in contracts as well. It's really, I guess, a data-driven approach to understanding who's the most vulnerable and where they are, and trying to align service delivery and our contracts to better meet that.
Thanks. And this kind of feeds in, all these questions actually feed in quite nicely to the next question, in terms of the evaluation of the outcomes of the program. I think you've talked about developing a program logic. Are you at the stage of evaluation? How are you finding that? Are you achieving what you set out to achieve?
Yeah, so the program commenced in July. The new program only commenced in 1st of July. So we do have an evaluation framework which we're working on, which we'll start to put in place over the next 12 months. But the evaluation hasn't started yet, but it'll be obviously a key component in our kind of broader commissioning approach to the program. So what we learn out of the evaluation will absolutely feed back into the ongoing kind of redesign work in the program. We'll have some data matching, which we'll do through our data exchange platform, which is kind of with the Commonwealth, which will kind of data match to some of our existing data in our child story data system in Communities and Justice, which will kind of give us an indication on whether children and young people are kind of being diverted from the child protection system. But that evaluation is yet to come.
Look forward to hearing more about it. Maybe you can come back in a year's time or whenever the point is and tell us how you went. I wanted to move on to some questions about learnings for other sectors or other parts of kind of service delivery. Can you, that will, I think, also feed in nicely to our next session. But can you tell us about any learnings you have? And I'm thinking, surely there must be some stuff that the aged care sector can learn from you guys.
Do you want to go first, Kitsu?
Yeah, look, the big thing for me is rethinking government's role as a market steward. So the concept of being a market steward is it's a commissioning concept, and I think it's where we really need to be headed in government. And what that means to me is we've moved away from often in service delivery the department delivering the services itself traditionally, and then we've gone through a period of outsourcing services either partially or fully. And then we've also got these other systems where we've always given grants, and often the grants are quite hands-off. Market stewardship requires you to think of whenever the government is funding anyone else to do service delivery, that they think about that as a commissioner, they should run that service system. Anthony, what's dinging? Is that your washing machine again?
It's my telephone.
His washing machine went off yesterday in the practice. Sorry. So we need to think of the service system as a system that we as the commissioner are the steward of, and the steward has different levers it can pull to influence that service system or that market. So there's price, there's regulation, there's contracts. But market stewardship means taking a long-term view of where you want that market to be. And, you use the example of aged care. So really the issue there is quality. So you'd be thinking about how can I, as the market steward, influence the makeup of that market to ensure that we're getting more quality providers. and that we're losing the low quality providers, and how will I influence that to happen now, but also what's my long-term view of that, and how do I start working not only with the current providers but with potential providers to shape that market over time and really have a vision of that and realise that you can do that as government and you can be quite transparent about it. I think that's quite a fresh way of thinking, and I think that's something that I hope people will go away with today and think about, how am I a steward of the service system that I'm involved with.
And I think the other thing I'd mention too, I think, is about engagement and kind of listening to the, I guess, diverse range of voices kind of in the process. I guess one of the things we learned in TI, a really diverse range of stakeholders, both across non-government organisations, the government and the government sector, local government, and the time and resource and the effort to ensure in any kind of, I guess, needs and design kind of process, giving opportunity for people to have that voice, to hear about outcomes that they value, priorities that they think are important to them and their families and clients and their communities, listening to the input of clients, I think can only really enrich the process. And as I think Kitson mentioned at the end of our kind of talk, a lot of work up front, but a much better payoff downstream in terms of not only better quality services, but a much more smoother transition, less disruption when you're looking at making kind of significant change to a service system.
Sorry, I guess for government and the private sector and NGOs, we're all having to make quite difficult choices about how to prioritise various outcomes, particularly in a fiscally constrained environment. How did you build in and how did you go about thinking about prioritising different aspects and outcomes through the process?
Yeah, it's a good question. We only had the funding that we had within the early intervention service system to work with, so it's $160 million is a lot. But given this kind of scale of the service system, there was no new money. So the first thing, obviously, that people wanted to know was, well, how can we make the changes that you're asking us to make without new money? What about the things that we're doing? So I guess a couple of key things that we did early on, we were very upfront, very transparent, and continued to kind of explain that there is no new money in this process. It has to be around using the resources that we have, and using data and evidence to kind of, I guess, then prioritise what's important, what was important to clients, what was important to communities, and what was important to NGOs in terms of kind of outcomes, and really kind of having some kind of, I guess, frank and robust discussions about having to prioritise a long list of priorities and knowing that we can only fund certain things. But again, using data to kind of continue to kind of inform that discussion, and then continuing to kind of stay engaged with the sector and have that long conversation about that was, it did help. It didn't, not everybody was obviously happy around some of the changes that we needed to make. But being transparent and using data to inform the conversations was certainly helpful. And I guess also kind of challenging some of the, I guess, not necessarily myths, but some of the long-held beliefs about why we're doing certain things and what they actually deliver. Again, was something that kind of that did help.
And I'll just add to that and just kind of take it back a step and say, in my experience, even just starting off and having a conversation about outcomes really forces leadership to ask that question about what do I prioritise. And I'll just give two quick examples. The first one is we were speaking to the Department of Education a couple of months ago about recommissioning a program that they have in schools. And I said, well, what's the point of the program? And they said, well, it started off about a way of keeping kids in school who are disengaging with school. So we put them in these programs to help them engage. But over time, it's become more about alternative pathways for kids and helping them find what's right for them if it's not school. But I think some teachers think of it as a program where you send kids where you can't handle them anymore in the classroom, you put them in this program. And I said, well, your first step is to identify what is it? What is the outcome? Do you want kids to stay in school? Do you want them to find what's right for them? Or do you just want a place to go? Or is it a mix of all three? And if it is, put that on the table and be clear with your minister that you know, we're trying to do all different things, and that's why we might get all different providers doing different interventions in that regard. And another one is around a service that we have in Justice, which is about mediation. And I was asking the question to this leadership, is the point of offering mediation to divert people from the court system, or is the point of offering mediation to reduce the level of conflict in the community? And it seems to be a simple question, but there's been a lot of policy making and a lot of investment in the mediation alternative dispute resolution system over recent years, and a lot of discussion in and around this. But for this particular service, they weren't clear about what the outcome was, and so it was actually important just to put that on the table and have leadership actually giving some clear direction to the service about this is why you exist and this is the difference we expect you to be making.
Yeah, I think it helps in establishing new policy or implementing policy to have a clear outcome or goal in mind, a problem that you're trying to address. We might do one other question I wanted to ask at the end because it will feed in nicely, and then we're going to have a little bit of a break after that. So the question is, often we are discussing with stakeholders an idea or concept, implementing policy or implementing service delivery, making changes, reform, and in a context where there is some questions about trust. And I wanted to ask how you, either personally or as an organisation, developed trust within your stakeholders in what government was doing and you as well.
I might go first and then you go, Kits. Yeah, I think it's a really difficult and challenging thing to kind of develop trust with providers and communities, particularly where some of the experiences they've had with the department in terms of some of the reforms have not been, what they've considered to be a good experience. Some of the things I think we did in the TI reform, which helped, but certainly the conversations weren't easy, was we were quite open and upfront about some of the challenges and some of the areas where we haven't done well in the past. And again, kind of we're upfront around why we were looking to make the changes that we were looking to make. Things like we had no new funding, we had to work within existing resources. We kind of committed to develop a lot of the kind of new program and deliver the reform together with the sector. So we worked quite closely with our peaks, and we did a lot of kind of engagement, public engagement with the sector. We did a lot of workshops and forums across the state, engaged providers directly, and just continued kind of to have those conversations, particularly around some of the difficult components of the reform where we needed to really push for change, and acknowledge some of the limitations that we had, acknowledge some of the kind of the things that we hadn't done well in the past, and kind of use again kind of some of the data and the evidence to kind of reinforce around why we're looking to make the changes that we did. But also, I think the last thing would be kind of where we're able to deliver on what we said we would. Kind of, we talked about that, but if we weren't able to deliver on what we did, then again we'll be upfront about that and explain the reasons why. Some people, and that didn't satisfy everybody, but certainly we tried to, I guess, to be more transparent, I think is probably what I'm trying to say.
Thank you. So on behalf of the community of policy practitioners, I want to thank you both for presenting today. It's been very informative, and I think we've really got into the detail and of what it's been like, and also to see something that's just being rolled out kind of almost live is quite exciting for us. Often we're quite kind of retrospective in our understanding, so it's quite a fascinating insight for all of us. Thank you very much for our audience. We're going to just take a break for, we've got 4 minutes. So we're going to take a break for 4 minutes. You might like to stretch, grab a glass of water, and you can keep your WebEx on while that happens, but we're just going to put up a holding screen while we get organised for our next presenters. Thank you very much, Kitsa and Anthony, again.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello, if you're just tuning in now, welcome to the Community of Policy Professionals webinar on stakeholder engagement in a policy context. Before introducing our presenters for this session, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting today and show my respect to elders past, present and emerging, as well as extending a warm welcome to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders with us today. Our presenters for this session are Paul McKnight and Stephen Bray, both from the Department of Communities and Justice. Paul McKnight is currently the Acting Deputy Secretary for Law Reform and Legal Services at the Department of Communities and Justice, but his normal job is as Executive Director of Policy and Reform, and he's been doing that for 5 years. Prior to that, he was Director of the New South Wales Law Reform Commission, and his career has mostly been in policy in a range of roles in New South Wales and New Zealand in the justice sector. Stephen Bray is the Director of Civil Justice, Vulnerable Communities and Inclusion. In his role, he advises the Attorney-General and the Minister for Families, Communities and Disability Services on law reform and legal policy. Prior to working in the department, Stephen worked as a lawyer in the UK public service and in large law firms. Now, Paul and Stephen have a presentation ready to share with you today, but we're going to do that before we open it up to questions from the audience. And if you have a question, pop it in the chat with all section of WebEx, and I'll facilitate questions to our speakers at the end of their presentation. And just a reminder, don't forget, if you are joining us now, turn off your camera and your microphone. And to do this, you hover your mouse over the screen and you'll see two circle buttons that come up. One is your microphone and one is your camera, and they should be turned off. Okay, so Paul and Stephen, it's over to you now.
Thanks for the introduction. I'll start sharing some content and Paul will begin our presentation.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. Okay. Welcome, everybody, to this presentation on stakeholder engagement. Stephen and I are both work in the Department of Communities and Justice, and we work together in policy world, basically. Mostly we work on legislative policy, but not exclusively. In fact, we do work across service design and strategic policy areas as well. Our area supports the stronger communities cluster ministers. So we handle all the legislative work for the department, and we do most of the policy development work on the justice side. So that's kind of our frame of reference for coming at this today. Today we're going to talk about stakeholder and engagement, and to me this is really kind of one half of the policy development process. It sits alongside the technical parts of policy development, the research, analysis and writing associated with policy development. So for me, it's really important that as policy workers, we've got a bunch of tools in our toolkit to engage with stakeholders, and really important that that sits alongside the way we think about policy. The outline of today, which is on the next slide, really we're going to do a little bit of theory about why we might talk to stakeholders, and then some work on how you map stakeholders, the levels of engagement you might want to have with them, the kinds of ways you might engage with stakeholders, and then some little bit of case study work on criminal justice reforms and the recent defamation reforms. I should start out with a couple of notes about terminology, and the first thing I should say is that we are not really very hung up on terminology in this presentation. Stakeholders can mean lots of things. I guess technically it's about being concerned in or having an interest in the issue that you're talking about, but really when lots of us use the term, we're really just talking about anybody you want to engage with and talk to. So that's how we're using it here. Engagement we're using as a kind of umbrella term for any kind of interaction with a stakeholder. We'll also use we'll use consultation as a term. I guess in a technical sense, that's a bit narrower. It's a kind of interaction you have with a stakeholder where you're listening to them and taking account of their positions, but throwing it into a decision-making mix that is out of their hands. So it's a kind of mid-range interaction. But we're probably going to use it really loosely to mean any kind of interaction as we go on. So don't get too hung up on that either. this is a slide really about why stakeholders are important and what our frame of reference is when we come to thinking about stakeholders. So for us, I think there are a couple of goals, a couple of deliverables out of a good policy development process. One of the deliverables is a really excellent analysis of the problem, a good analysis of the options, a robust understanding of what you want to do, all encapsulated in a really great decision-making document, which might be a report, it might be a cabinet sub, it might be a brief, it might be a PowerPoint presentation, but really that's a deliverable. The second kind of deliverable I think that we want out of a process is a really well-informed stakeholder base that's ready for change, ready for the policy that is being developed and government is working to sign off on. Which doesn't mean they've bought into everything necessarily, but they do understand where it's come from and what, and they're ready for it when it comes along. So I guess there are kind of four aspects to what you're trying to do with the stakeholders in that process. And the first, I guess, is informing policy development, and I'll have a bit more to say about that a bit later on. But this is all about trying to help with the technical aspects of policy thinking, gather the evidence, define the problem, sort through the options, predict the consequences of those options, and sort out a decision. We all want to be client or customer or citizen-centric in our policy design. So it's from listening to stakeholders that we get that sense of what the client, what the citizen needs out of the process and build that into our policy. The second kind of frame of reference, I think, is about building relationship capital. Most of us are working with stakeholders on a repeated basis, whether that's a community we're working with or a set of peak bodies. There are a lot of repeat players in the process. So each interaction that we're having with people builds on the previous interaction, and there's an opportunity to build trust and understanding for the next time we head into policy work with them. They'll come to understand how you approach issues and trust your process. The third kind of frame of reference, I think, is about making implementation of policy a success. So a great policy isn't self-executing, whether it's a strategy or a piece of legislation or even a service design. Policy works through individual decisions made by humans, and often those humans are people you've talked to in the consultation or engagement process, or they are people who will be part of a peak or part of a community that knows about what you're doing. So it's important that people understand what the policy is about, because they're actually going to be the ones implementing it on the ground. And the fourth kind of frame of reference we come at this from is this idea that that the relationship is a two-way relationship. So all of our stakeholders are trying to change the world in one way or another, and in most cases that's for the better. So policy making, policy discussions are a kind of mutual endeavour, and we need to be really respectful of the facts that stakeholders are engaging with us to further their ends and for mutual influence, and be respectful of their purposes and acknowledge and help where we can. It is a two-way conversation. On the next slide, I think we've just got a bit of a framework for how we're going to approach the questions as we get into them. So the first set of questions is about why are we consulting, why are we engaging? Then we're going to talk about who, what level of engagement, and what the method of consultation or engagement will be. And I want to start off with why we're consulting. So why are we talking to stakeholders? And I guess this is our little picture of what I might describe as the policy hopper. and three kinds of frames of reference that you're coming at the stakeholders with when you're talking to them at different stages of your policy development. So the first reason here is about building an evidence base. So good policies grounded in good evidence, good data, good research, good understanding of the theoretical background. But stakeholders will have a heap of the evidence that we need to form up our understanding of the policy issue. So they will have data, they'll have documents. I think most importantly, though, they'll have an experience of the world that is different from our own. And we all know that as we sit at our desks and we look at the data and we look at the reports, it gives us an incomplete picture. For those of us that work in the legal sphere, we often look at the legislation as a starting point, but we also know that the legislation does not reflect the actual experience of how it works on the ground. So we're talking to stakeholders about that experience. Some of the stakeholders we're engaging with here are our own operational arms, who will have a much deeper understanding of the service than we do as policy workers. Our service providers, so NGOs and others in the sector, in the legal sector, the lawyers are often important people to talk to. The experience of clients or customers or citizens, whether we're able to gather those directly or they're reported to us through their representatives or through peaks, all of that will build our evidence base. I think one of the really important things we're trying to develop here is in imagination. We're trying to understand the experience of the world through our stakeholders' eyes and through all of our stakeholders' eyes. So we're trying to develop through gathering evidence and talking to people, an understanding and an empathy about what that stakeholder's position feels like for them. We're also, secondly, I guess, trying in the policy process to develop options and solutions for the problems that we come to. Stakeholders are often experts in their field, whether they're operational experts or experts as consumers of our services and our policies. They can often help creatively think through options that might solve the problem. And often if we might try and prompt that creativity from them by giving information and evidence traditionally in writing, but often in other ways as well. And working with stakeholders collaboratively can often develop options that will form the basis of the kinds of solutions that we want to look at. And they'll also have a whole lot of experience in data that can predict the outcomes associated with the options that we're exploring. So that's part of our technical process as well. And finally, we're looking really to engage with stakeholders to build support for the policy outcomes. We talked in the last section about bringing people along the journey. That's often part of the idea. But even when even when the stakeholders are not fully bought into our solution, if we talk to them and engage with them in the right way, and they can see interests taken into account, and they can see that their interests are balanced fairly in the process, and they feel like they've had a fair say, that process itself can generate support for the kinds of compromises that are made along the way. And I think the greatest failure in any policy process is when we get to the end and the process is, the government is accused of not having consulted with someone. It's problematic in terms of our engagement with the community, but it's also problematic in that it shifts the argument about the right outcome into process and away from the kind of debate that you might have about a policy outcome that focuses on what is the right answer, what will be the right solution for the community in any given context. So Stephen, over to you.
Thanks, Paul. So let me just change the slide. Yes. So as Paul mentioned, I'm going to be going through slides talking about who we're consulting with, what levels of engagement sort of look like in a conceptual framework for that, and finally what different methods of engagement might be. So in terms of who we're consulting with, it's really important to map the stakeholders pretty comprehensively from the outset. So you really need to think about all the bodies that kind of your proposal is going to affect. So I guess the downstream bodies, all the bodies which kind of needed to kind of make it happen. So all the kind of upstream bodies as well. And in between, like all those entities that are required to like authorize it as well. So let's not forget them. So there are a variety of sort of technical kind of stakeholder mapping exercises that you can do that are really valuable. I think it's really important to just don't assume that you personally know all the stakeholders that are out there in a particular field. Ask around your colleagues, check in with some of the stakeholders you know if you think that they think of anyone else that is missing from your kind of map. And as Paul mentioned, there's nothing worse than getting to the end of a project and realizing you've just forgotten to consult with a particular stakeholder who's actually quite influential. So I'll run through on this slide some of the categories of stakeholders you might think of, which kind of might prompt some ideas about who you might go to. So first of all, the public. I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory, but if a proposal affects the public, generally you might consider some form of public consultation. That requires a very different kind of communication approach. And also, if you're going out to the public, you're probably going to require at least ministerial authorization and possibly cabinet authorization as well. The second category we've listed there is clients. So who's your proposal intended to benefit? Who's the ultimate recipient of what you're doing? If it's important to talk to them, obviously, to make sure you're getting it right. Thirdly, I guess there's a category which is sometimes neglected is that of experts. So as much as in policy world, we kind of get across issues fairly quickly, there's inevitably those people out there with technical expertise that far exceeds ours and have been working in the field for quite a while. And you might be consulting with these people, not in their kind of capacity and their personal stake in the issue, but more just to sort of seek their advice generally in relation to the issue. So they could be just people in the government or in the field or possibly paid experts, but even academics, they're often willing to participate in these processes to kind of further their own professional development. Next, the breadth of stakeholders can be a bit intimidating at times, but sometimes these stakeholders kind of form together in like natural forums or fora. So it's worthwhile thinking about whether there are existing fora that you can tap into. To give a kind of example of that, a couple of years ago, we were working on some reforms to the Coroners Act in relation to like how the bodies of deceased people are treated after they've died in accordance with religious customs. So in theory, we would have liked to have consulted with all the heads of all the various religions in New South Wales. It's obviously quite a big task, so we didn't really know where to start. So we went to Multicultural New South Wales, and they actually put us onto a religious leaders forum, which was held periodically at Parliament House, and we attended that, presented on the proposal we were doing, handed out some fact sheets, had some good discussions, and as a result, got some good feedback from those entities. Next of all, peak bodies. So this is pretty critical and in a common part of any like big consultation process, that all the a lot of the individual sort of entities that are affected by proposals have naturally kind of formed into representative. So that's useful, not just from a practical perspective in terms of like you only need to consult with one body instead of 200 other bodies, but also that peak body, often their role is to kind of synthesize the often divergent views of the entities that kind of exist within that structure. So to give an example of a common peak body that we consult with a lot within the department is the Law Society of New South Wales. So they represent the views of all lawyers in New South Wales, and they have several, underneath their sort of head body, they have several committees which are constituted of different experts in the field that feed into that. So they're really critical for a lot of our policy development. And finally, and last but not least, operational agencies. So clearly, like if you can develop the best best theoretical policy in the world, but if it isn't actually implemented on the ground, and if it can't actually get working, it's really not worth anything at all. So it's really important to involve all those entities that will be required to actually like operationalize and implement whatever your policy proposal is, not just at the end stage when it's time to implement, but also at the beginning stage, at the design stage, so you understand all the practicalities of it and what might need to change, and even just timeframes as to how long things will need to actually get off the ground. I'll talk in this slide a little bit about levels of engagement. So there's kind of a spectrum of like the level of engagement you need from a stakeholder, and one useful tool to kind of conceptualize this is the IAP spectrum of public participation. So this kind of, it's designed for public participation, but really it's applicable to a relationship to any stakeholder. And it goes from like the one end being, just informing stakeholders to the other end actually empowering them to make the decisions. So at the kind of, and what the kind of level of engagement you need, like really depends on like what the purpose of your consultation is, and also who the stakeholder is as well, and what their expertise is. So at the lower end, you've got like informing, which is a one-way communication, which you're simply notifying stakeholders of what it is. And this could be in the form of a fact sheet or any other kind of one-way communication. Taking it a step up, you're consulting with stakeholders. I mean, we use that word consulting in a broader sense, but in this context, it's more like a sort of, you're consulting with them on a proposal and they will feed into your proposal. You'll take their views into account. The next level up is involving them in the decision making. So it's a little bit more two-way in that like there's a bit of a back and forth between their involvement and their participation in the process and kind of nutting out ideas with them. A lot of the work that happens in policy kind of falls between the consulting and involving kind of stages in my experience. The next level of engagement up is collaboration. So that's like a real partnership with your stakeholders in what you're trying to deliver as equal. So an example of this might be kind of a jointly run project between two different departments. And finally, at the far end of it, you've got empowering. So that's actually like you are actually placing the final decision making in the hands of the stakeholder at the end of the process. So determining what level of engagement you have with the stakeholder is really important to kind of dictate your strategy from the beginning, what your methods of consultation are going to look like, but critically like what the governance of your project looks like. So if with a stakeholder, if you're up on like the right-hand side of the spectrum and you're looking at collaboration and empowering, and you need to actually really involve them in the authorization framework, you might consider things like forming a steering committee, including those members, and potentially, depending on the size of the project, like sub-working groups that feed into that steering committee and form part of that governance framework. The next slide, I'll talk a little bit about potential methods of consultation. So when people think about consultation, often they kind of think about it in a very formal sense, like the kind of green paper, white paper type approach, which is really useful, but is really just part of a broader spectrum of all the different ways in which you can consult. And what method you choose depends on the communication needs of the person you're consulting with, what level of engagement you need, and most importantly, why you're consulting and what you hope to get out of it. So at the one end, informal consultation, it's probably something we do every day, all the time. So this could be just meeting up over coffee, it could be getting on the phone with them, but more often than not, it's going to be kind of an email between a couple of people, the way that we tend to work now. So this is going to be appropriate if you've got an existing quite strong relationship with the stakeholder. Maybe you're not seeking sort of formal endorsement or authorization, but you're just kind of trying to gauge their views at that point. So that's often what we would do at that point. The next example is a public survey. So if you're attempting to gauge the general public sentiment in relation to a particular policy, one way of consulting is through like a survey process. This is a type of communication to the public which is quite catered for those needs, and it could be like distilled into like a simple sort of survey form to kind of get the kind of feedback you might get from the public, but can be used in some circumstances quite creatively as well. So I guess a recent example from our department's perspective is the Law Reform Commission is currently reviewing the law on consent in the context of its application in criminal sexual assault proceedings, and it wanted to know like what the general public thought valid consent was in that context. So they asked them. So they put out a survey. It had a series of hypothetical scenarios and whether or not people thought these things constituted valid consent in those circumstances. And The next example, which is quite commonly used, is a round table. So it's a really great way of kind of digging into issues once you've already got some preliminary feedback and you kind of want to flesh it out a bit more. It involves getting like a series of stakeholders together at the one meeting, and we don't get them all together in the one meeting just because that's convenient for us to hear from them all at the same time, although it is convenient. But it's a really useful tool so that they can hear from each other and that they can understand the different perspectives that others are bringing, and that it's not simply a two-way communication between the policymaker and whoever the stakeholder is, but actually like there's a whole range of views and a lot of different players in there. It's also useful for potentially moving stakeholders away from kind of a position-based approach, which they might have had before, to kind of digging into and understand the interests underlying that and moving them towards like an interest-based negotiation and potentially finding middle ground and innovative solutions in that regard. The next category is really written communication, which is pretty essential for anything of any level of complexity or anything requiring formal authorization. But there's also quite a lot of variations within that. So your kind of traditional green paper, white paper structure is used quite a lot. It's really useful. So the green papers are when you're kind of scoping out issues and developing options, like the big consultation paper based on that. And white papers are when you've narrowed those down a bit, and really you are really digging into like what some potential proposals might be and draft recommendations. Obviously there's also options papers, discussion papers, or if you're at the kind of pointy end of the legislative process, you might have draft legislation that you're consulting on. And the final example is like workshops or journey mapping. So this is your dreaded whiteboard post-it note scenario, but is actually really useful at the beginning stage of a project when you're trying to scope out the issues, when you're trying to figure out what the right outcome might be, and you're kind of in that ideation or design phase of a policy project. And it can also be really useful even down the track when you're kind of a bit of the way through the process and actually a really thorny issues come up. There's not any one clear solution that you can kind of step back and kind of brainstorm, and you can get people's views. Sometimes people's views who are like might be otherwise a bit reluctant to express them formally. If you put them in a room with some blank post-it notes and a whiteboard and you can kind of note it out, you might get a lot more from them that way. The next slide is going to be just like an example of a stakeholder consultation plan. Sometimes people are a bit kind of reluctant to develop these. They think they're like a huge amount of work, but they really don't have to be. It's really just putting down what you think you are going to do through stakeholder engagement on paper. It doesn't need fancy graphics. It doesn't need big charts of influence and interests. At its core, it just needs a few key elements. It needs to list the stakeholders you are going to consult with, what your kind of timetable looks like and your methods of consultation. It gives you a chance to think about resourcing and the governance of your project as well. And finally, risk and mitigation. So it's useful not just for the sake of writing it down and mapping it out, but also gives you something to bring to others to sort of run it past them, see if you're missing any stakeholders, seeing if there are different ways of approaching the consultation that they might know. So I've seen plans which are, no more than a couple of pages long, and they've been perfectly adequate for that scenario, and some which are quite a lot more detailed because it's a really big, complex project with moving parts, and that's appropriate there as well. In the next couple of slides, I've got an example of a consultation plan we did. I'm not going to go through the details of it, but just so if people haven't seen one before, they kind of know what they might look like. This is a consultation plan we did earlier on in defamation reforms, which I'll talk a bit more about later. But really, it's a document which sets out the purpose of why it's there, a detailed timetable of what's going to happen and what the methods are. It goes through to a particular aspect of this stakeholder engagement, which was the constitution of an expert panel and how that fits into the process. And then finally, most essentially, like a list of all the stakeholders that we are going to consult with and their contact details. I mean, it's a very practical issue, but really important. And then at the end, kind of an analysis of risks and mitigation. So that's kind of, I guess, most of the kind of theoretical framework we wanted to provide you. We're going to move on now to a couple of case studies, and I think Paul's going to lead off with a case study relating to criminal justice reforms.
Thanks, Stephen. So I guess this is going to be a picture of a very broad set of reforms And I'm going to skate across the top a little with this and talk about some particular examples of consultation methods, engagement methods that worked. So those set of reforms were implemented in 2018 to the criminal justice system. There are a number of aspects to them, but three of the important aspects are the reforms to sentencing law, which involved the creation of new community-based sentences, so a complete new set of community-based sentences, designed really to make it easier for people to get sentences in the community rather than short spells of imprisonment, since short spells of imprisonment increase the risk of reoffending over a community-based approach. Also changes to the framework for parole decision-making. So this gets people out of prison at the end of their sentence for a period of supervision. And finally, and probably the most complex parts of the reforms were changes to the way the pre-trial process works for serious jury trials. And really these were designed to ensure that people had incentives to plead guilty early if they were going to plead guilty, and to avoid pleas of guilty at the steps of the court right at the trial. So jury trials are 18-month, 2-year process, and the problem was that too many people were pleading guilty right near the end of the process, causing cost, difficulty, and concern to victims. So these were called the early appropriate guilty plea reforms. All of these reforms were based on Law Reform Commission reports. So there were kind of three phases for the reforms. First of all, there was a Law Reform Commission phase from about 2012 to 2015, a pre-cabinet phase from about 2015 to 2017, and then a legislative development stage from 2017 to 2018. The reforms exist in a very complex and layered stakeholder landscape. So the legal system reform, so we have a lot of stakeholders operating in the legal system, operating agencies like corrections, the courts, the DPP, legal aid, police, the judges who have particular needs, particularly the heads of jurisdiction. They operate independently of government, and their independence is jealously guarded. The legal sector stakeholders, so peaks like the Law Society and the Bar Association, and including the Aboriginal Legal Service, who have an important policy voice in most legal debates. There were also Aboriginal community stakeholders who have an interest in this area. Victims of crime and the peak bodies that represent them have an interest. Accused people and offenders were recognised as a stakeholder, and particularly the representatives of vulnerable accused and offenders, so particularly peaks who deal with mental health and cognitive impairment issues in the criminal justice system, community law centres, people who work with young people especially. So I wanted to talk a little bit about a few of the methods used for engagement at periods along the way in the development of this reform. And I'm going to do that by talking about some of the methods that were used. So I want to talk first about the issue of using formal papers, so written material. Formal papers are used a lot by the Law Reform Commission. They are used a lot by government agencies as well to gather public and stakeholder opinion. The Law Reform Commission in this context used multiple issues papers seeking submissions and got lots of submissions. Different kind of strategies were used to frame up those papers by the Commission. So some of them followed the legislative framework and asked questions about that framework. That was particularly the case for parole and sentencing. For early guilty pleas, really, the thinking was a bit less processy than that. And the kind of paper issued looked more like a research paper than an options or an issues paper. And really it was designed to expose all the different ways in which different other jurisdictions and other entities had looked at the problem. So a lot less coherent as a paper, but a lot more divergent in the way it invited submissions. Papers were also used for particular interactions along the way. So as we formed up ideas in the cabinet stage, papers were issued to targeted stakeholders for consultation that tried to step people through the various questions that arose. Papers were also used for interacting with victims groups, for example, but much shorter papers that really tried to point up the issue from the perspective of that group, so they could read it in advance of a meeting, so they weren't coming cold to the issue, rather than a very long paper that would take much more effort to engage with. Roundtables were particularly useful in this process, particularly, I think a really good example was the roundtables that we held in the context of developing cabinet proposals on early appropriate guilty pleas. Those reforms were quite controversial and very complex, and were not ever going to have consensus of all the stakeholders emerge. Particularly the defence and the prosecution interests around the table were never going to agree on all aspects. So the roundtable approach, and the roundtables were large, so there'd often be 20 odd people sitting around the table. They were designed to hash through the issues, find agreement where agreement could be reached, and isolate those areas where agreement was not going to be reached, and try and really winnow down the key arguments that were being had in order to advise government on what the answer should be at the end of the day. Roundtables were used in a different way for victims groups and groups representing vulnerable accused people, particularly at the legislative stage, so quite late in the piece. And the intention there was to educate and inform people about where the philosophy of the reforms had come from, and to highlight issues for them and work through those concerns. So those were very successful in educating and garnering support for the reforms, actually. Reforms that you might not initially think would have support, for instance, from victims groups. And finally, we used workshops a lot. Workshops were particularly helpful at the legislative design stage, where operating agencies, lawyers, courts, corrections were able to gather together and really get to grips with the detail of the process design in order to make sure the legislation was appropriate. And that was a very collaborative kind of approach to the work, and very successful in getting that detail worked through. So Stephen, you're going to talk to us about DEFO, I think.
Yes, thanks, Paul. So I'll talk a little bit about reforms to defamation law, which are a hot topic. They're being debated in Parliament today. So this case study is about recent reforms we did to the model defamation law provisions, and I'll talk a little bit about how we approach stakeholder consultation in that regard, because it kind of brings to light some of the things we've been talking about today. So to give some context, since 2005, all Australian jurisdictions have agreed on model defamation law provisions. So it's effectively one set of laws that each jurisdiction enacts in their own jurisdiction to make sure we've got like a level playing field across all Australian jurisdictions. And given people are defamed often across borders, also now than ever, prior to 2005, each state did their own thing. prior to then, back in history, people used to deal with defamation by chopping out tongues or potentially challenging people to duels. So we've moved on at least a little bit since then. So the challenges for this project, so really at the time the defamation laws were agreed in 2005, it was really before social media had taken off. So it's now more convenient than ever to defame people online, and our law is kind of catching up with that. And it was in pretty dire need of an update. But it was a bit of a challenging area. So some of the challenges in particular are that it's a highly technical area of law. It's extremely complex. The trials are notorious for going on for very long periods and getting wound up on legal argument. So it's an area where any change to the law has to be pretty closely scrutinised. Secondly, it's a model regime. So all jurisdictions and all attorneys general across the entire country need to buy into it. So there's that process of gaining consensus, which adds another level of complexity. And finally, there are highly influential groups with a very big stake in the matter, most obviously including media organisations who are often on the receiving end of defamation lawsuits, but also politicians and the legal profession, even some celebrities, some of those people illustrated on the slide as well. So I guess in terms of those challenges, I'll just talk about some of the things we did in the process. So firstly, acknowledging this was an extremely complex and technical area of law, what we did from the outset was form a technical expert panel. So this wasn't a body which had any sort of like formal decision-making role or authorization role, but they were there as a panel of experts to inform our policy advice to the Attorney General, and that we could use to kind of develop and bounce ideas off. So on that panel, we had 2 members of the judiciary, the heads of the defamation lists in the Supreme Court and District Court. We had an academic who literally wrote the textbook on defamation law. We had the Solicitor General as well. So we really had like a huge amount of knowledge and expertise, and they were very generous in giving us their time for that. So it served an invaluable purpose, not only in us making sure we got the law right, but also in giving others confidence that we'd actually thought through these things, that we could say, well, we've discussed it with the expert panel, these were their views, and that's why we're taking the direction that we're taking. I guess the second challenge is in terms of like the buy from other jurisdictions and governance. So that was, again, an example where you needed to think about the governance and the authorizing structure up front. So we didn't want to have a reform where like we went off and developed a law and then just like chucked it onto the Council of Attorneys General agenda and expected them all to agree. We formed a defamation working party which consisted of all jurisdictions, and actually all the papers and the legislation actually came from that working party, which consisted of representatives from our sort of Department of Justice, Communities and Justice counterparts in all other jurisdictions. So getting that made us kind of resolve those issues with other jurisdictions first. So by the time that it was actually presented to ministers, it was a kind of united national position already. Finally, not finally, but another issue was the kind of breadth of stakeholders involved. Like there are sort of innumerable media organizations that would have an interest in defamation law, and a lot of those entities wouldn't have the same ideas in mind either. So really we heavily leveraged off the peak bodies that are involved. So there's actually there's a coalition of most of the peak media organizations that have got together and formed a coalition called Australia's Right to Know. They were really useful in terms of getting a consolidated position from them, and also having like representatives of that group attend at various discussions we had. Another group which people might not be aware of, like in terms of consulting with social media companies, so you know, Facebook, Google, Twitter, YouTube, all of that. They've actually also formed a coalition called Digi, which represents their consolidated interests as well. So we used Digi and we spoke to them, and that was again a useful tool to kind of make it kind of manageable, but also again tie their views into like a single position. In terms of the method of consultation, obviously it's quite a technical area. Like the written papers were essential. We went through a kind of, I guess, a fairly traditional structure of like the running past like what the ideas for reform might be, and then sort of fleshing those out, and then a kind of big second round of consultation when we actually had the draft legislation that went out, not just to those stakeholder groups, but also publicly to give anyone the chance to provide input. I guess another method we'd use, like following receipt of all the submissions on the kind of written papers we went out, that kind of would usually distill the issues down to a few key ones, and we'd use those to kind of develop ideas for like roundtables. So sometimes we'd have roundtables which are grouped around specific stakeholder groups, and sometimes we'd have them around particular issues. So one thing in particular was the new kind of public interest defence for journalism that we kind of had to flesh out like in a separate discussion because it was one of the thorny issues. So it was a bit dynamic, and you had to kind of shift over time as these things tend to run. So ultimately the process was successful. It was agreed by the Council of Attorneys General, I think, less than a couple of weeks ago, and it's being debated in Parliament today. So that's that case study. So we've got a little bit of time now for questions.
Oh, wow. That was a lot of people. Yes, we've got heaps of questions, so that's great. And we've got about 10 minutes. So let's see how we go in getting through them. So we've got a few questions on, knowing what's enough or too much. So how do you know if we're over consulting? I think that's often a fear that government we have within government. Oh, we've already talked to them about that. It'll be too much. It'll be too overwhelming. How do you judge what is the right level?
I think you can almost never over consult. It's like workplace communication. You can never over communicate. There is a question about stakeholder fatigue, though, when you are consulting stakeholders on a whole heap of questions all at once in a very tight time frame, and you do get pushback and concern raised by stakeholders, and you have to be very respectful of their time. But I very much doubt that you would ever get too many stakeholders saying to you, you talk to us too much about that issue, you listen to us too much. I think, though, you've got to be respectful of people's time and be prepared for the consultation and the engagement approach. Provide good background information, give people a good understanding of the questions that you want to engage with them on, and come to the discussions that you have with them that are face to face in a structured way, so that their time is well spent, and then use that information and report back to them what they have said appropriately, so they get a sense that you actually have understood and taken on board what they have to say. Stephen, did you have?
No, look, I 100% agree with what Paul said. As a rule of thumb, I kind of feel like if I feel like I'm consulting too much for stakeholders, I'm probably doing it just the right amount. Yeah.
What about the public, though? I think, when there are, groups or, particular experts, that is definitely true. They're very motivated to communicate to you and continue the dialogue. But the public at large might be a slightly different situation.
Look, I think with the public at large, you're mostly doing engagement methods that are fairly, I don't want to say passive, but the public choose to engage with the kinds of things you put out there. They choose to engage with the papers that you release, or the surveys you release, or the public meetings you have in those situations where you have it. So it is, I think, less of a problem. I think the bigger problem is when you are calling on a particular community repeatedly, again and again, and that can be a problem where you need to negotiate with that community about the consultation framework in which you're going to talk to them and the priorities that they might have. I'm talking here mostly about local communities, Aboriginal communities, the like, where a program, a negotiated program, might be a more appropriate way of thinking about those sorts of engagements.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think that the problem you might get from public consultation is not that you're consulting them too much, is that you don't actually getting enough feedback from them. And there are various ways to kind of encourage that. Like more recently in our consultations involving the public, like we've used social media quite a lot, like advertising through Facebook and Twitter, and that's been quite successful. The other area you might, which, the public consultation, which is really the biggest challenge, is catering your communication style to the public, and so that they distilling what might be kind of pretty complex policy ideas into a version which anyone can understand and kind of feedback into. There are obviously more, like if you're talking about consulting with the public at large, like that's one thing, but sometimes when you actually think about who you're trying to get to, it's actually a specific segment. Like it's the part of the public that are using a particular service, and there are particular ways to get in through them, like even like surveys at the end of service delivery, or even like, we haven't done too much of this, but I know some other agencies do actually establish focus groups, and there are agencies whose job it is to like run those focus groups and dig into issues and understand those issues a bit more. Oh, I think you're on mute, Louisa.
Thank you. Now into the category of what can go wrong. What is your advice or suggestions on, for example, specifically, I've sometimes worked in areas where people have very quite intractable views on things, very strongly held beliefs, and no amount of consultation will kind of change that. How do you, in that kind of context, make sure that you are both still listening to them, but also seeking the range of views that you need, and that you're not hearing, I guess, mostly from the people with the squeaky wheels or the most strongest held beliefs?
Do you want to start, Stephen?
Yeah, okay, I'll start. I mean, in terms of dealing with stakeholders with intractable views, I mean, I think, yes, we've all dealt with that. We've probably also been that stakeholder with the intractable view at some point. I think really, I mean, it's probably a topic for a whole different session in terms of like how you run, like in particular, like face-to-face interactions when encountering those sort of circumstances of conflict, and how you move people from the kind of position-based position that they come in with to actually really understanding the interest underlying it. But really, I think in my experience, a lot of the time when people come in with extremely strongly held views and often like very emotive views, they really they want to be heard. And like some of the key techniques you can use, like reflective listening, like repeating back to them what they've said, summarizing what they've said, so that they feel like they've been heard. And even if they don't agree with the decision, they understand their views have been taken into account in the process. Paul, do you have much to add to that?
Yeah, I think asking questions about the underlying drivers of those positions is really helpful to understand why people are taking the positions they take. I think exposing those people to other views can be helpful in terms of generating a good dialogue between the stakeholders. You want to be careful though, because some people you don't want to put in a room with other stakeholders. It might be damaging to the process. It might be damaging to the other stakeholders. So you have to be a bit careful and considered about what you do. You can't stop listening to the squeaky wheels, because the squeaky wheels are going to be problematic down the track if you don't listen to them. But you're right, you then have to be very creative and intentional about how you get other voices into the process when you know that there are other interests out there. So you might need to actually proactively reach out to people rather than waiting for them to come to you.
I also have quite a practical question about, but I think it goes to the development of trust. If we're going to do stakeholder consultation, people will want to know that it goes somewhere and it's used for something and it's influential. But how do you deal with the practicalities of stakeholder consultation? And I think there's a lot in there that we need to develop a better skill set around how we deal with the results of the consultation.
Yeah, I think I mean, in some cases you can report back the result of the consultation in as minutes or a report of the consultation, and that can be really helpful. Sometimes at the end of a set of roundtables, you might hold a roundtable where you report back on where you get to. And I know with early appropriate guilty pleas, we had an exactly that, a report back roundtable. Not everyone at that roundtable was completely on board with all the answers, but all of them were very respectful of being kept in the loop and us being very clear about what the outcome was. I think it's also necessary to keep stakeholders up to date. When you're dealing with them on a long policy process, it's necessary to keep them up to date with where things are up to. And if there are long periods of silence because you're within government, you're doing internal processes, just telling them that what's going on can be really important to maintain that trust. At the end of the day, doing what you say you are going to do is the basis of trust, and being very clear about what you can and can't do, and what the thinking is really important, I think.
No, I think that's right, Paul. And also, I think it kind of alludes to something that we covered a little bit in the presentation, that a lot of the stakeholders we deal with on a repeated basis, and that trust is kind of built up over time. And it's actually quite important in our jobs, I think, to make a really positive effort to go and build that relationship, even outside of, I've got a particular proposal and I want to know what your views are, like to maintain that relationship so you can kind of get to that higher level where you can have those open discussions without anyone feeling put offside. So I don't know, I guess I find in my job, like I have like a whole bunch of key stakeholders that I deal with all the time. I make an effort to go and see them even when I don't have a policy project on board, just to check in. You might have a regular monthly meeting. You might have something else, whatever works for you, but just to actually invest in that relationship itself.
That's great. I think those kind of practical tips are really useful for anyone thinking about consultation or in the middle of it and trying to diagnose where they need to go next. We will just finish up now because we're pretty much on time, but before we go, I just wanted to thank Paul and Stephen for sharing a very nice looking presentation with us today, very clear and insightful, and to our earlier speakers, Kitsa, Anthony and Victoria, for the presentation that they provided, and your teams that no doubt have supported you to talk to us today. Also thank Indy, who's been working in the background to make sure everything goes smoothly, and thank you to our audience for your great participation and fantastic questions. We look forward to you joining us again. We'll have another session in late August. Watch out for the notification on that. And Peter Shergold is going to join us in September as well. So thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you again in the future.